So in the final video of this series, we'll continue with Chicano rhetoric, and then we'll move into Western rhetoric before offering a quick summary. So the tradition of Chicano public speaking, Chicano communication, is derived from the Chicano movement of the primarily mid-20th century, 1950s, 1960s. This movement was a movement and a set of communication and rhetoric that was trying to forge a Mexican-American identity and a sense of pride and political power amongst this group of people, primarily living in the southwestern United States. To talk about the Chicano movement, I'm going to refer to the works of Gloria Anzaldúa and some of her concepts and themes that she talks about in her writings. And to begin with, I want to start with her idea of the borderlands. She actually writes a book called Borderlands La Frontera, which kind of theorizes about the Chicano experience, drawing heavily from her childhood growing up in Texas on the border of Mexico. And she reminds us that people of Mexican-American ancestry are in a really unique situation quite often. New Mexicans, people from Arizona, people from California, their families may have lived here hundreds, if not thousands of years, yet somehow in the United States they are seen as foreign or other or Mexican, right? Their families were Mexican in that Mexico used to be right, parts of the United States, and even before that, it was Spanish territory, right? As the saying goes, we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? So that's a pretty unique situation to be in. The Chicano experience in the United States of being both indigenous from here, but somehow seen as outside or other, Mexican, not American, right? So the Chicano identity is trying to capture that unique experience of being both Mexican and American, but neither Mexican nor American in some ways, even though arguably you're indigenous, right? You belong here more than perhaps anyone else. So this is what she refers to as the kind of situation of being in a borderlands, which causes a need for borderland rhetoric, right? We have folks who are in that situation have to deal with that when they are engaging in public rhetoric, right, or public speech or public communication. So what does that mean? The necessity for what we might call code switching. We mean this literally switching between languages here. Chicano Spanish, which is sometimes more informally called Spanglish, right, is a blend of the dominant English language in the United States and the dominant Spanish language in Mexico, both of which, of course, are European languages, right? So there's a kind of Spanglish or code switching or Chicano Spanish that is a regular practice among people of Mexican-American descent. So we often see bilingualism, code switching, the use of multiple languages in public speeches by Chicanos. There's also a concept that Anzaldúa gives us that she calls linguistic terrorism, right? And it's similar to that kind of stress we talked about with double consciousness in the Afrocentric point of view. Linguistic terrorism is the ways in which various institutions and other powerful entities have tried to regulate how Chicanos speak, right? We see it in the criticisms that come from mainstream Spanish speakers who view Spanglish or Chicano Spanish as being a kind of bastardization or a perversion of Spanish. They want to keep Spanish pure. And we can see that also from the point of view of the dominant English speakers in the United States who look down upon Chicano Spanish as not English, right? So there's a linguistic terrorism that occurs to people who were raised speaking Chicano Spanish and now have to contend with a culture that either demands Spanish or demands English, right? So again, we're in a position, or we see that Chicano speakers are in a position similar to black speakers where there's going to be some more creative demands put on their language use. And this is going to produce a really interesting rhetoric that we can all learn from. Another concept that Anzaldúa discusses that is kind of related to this idea of borderlands is the idea of the oh shoot, I practiced this too. Here we go with some linguistic terrorism coming from your Eurocentric teacher. Mestizaje, which the word mestizo comes from, which is the idea of mixing, right? And it meant the mixing of different races, but we could think here about the mixing of different cultures, right? Oftentimes, a Chicano person is in the position of being a kind of cultural hybrid, right? They are belonging to multiple cultures at the same time. And this leads Anzaldúa to note how the Chicano identity is often a challenge to certain simple binaries, black and white, American, Mexican. So what she calls for in Chicano rhetoric is a challenging of traditional Western binaries. Typically in Western thinking, we think in two pairs, where one of the items in the pair is the more valued item and the other is the subordinate item. That's a little confusing, so let me give you some examples here. In traditional Western thinking, there's a division between light and dark, where light tends to be valued and dark gets devalued. We could think about this when it comes to skin color. We could think about it when it comes to our ideas of good and evil. Being brown-skinned, being not quite white, not quite black, naturally or experientially challenges this Western binary. The binary between Western and non-Western is challenged by a Chicano person and by Chicano rhetoric. They are both Spanish and English speaking, which are Western cultures, and they derive many traditions from both of those cultures, as well as they have indigenous and non-Western American, Native American roots, right? So it challenges that divide as well. She calls us to challenge the divide between the mind and the body, where the mind is valued over the body, to challenge the dualistic binary between reason and imagination, where the Eurocentric viewpoint tends to value reason over magic and imagination and emotion. Same thing with rationality and spirituality. In the Western tradition, we focus almost exclusively on rationality. In Chicano rhetorics, we're going to see a lot more reference to and discussion of and evocation of spirituality, magic, things like that. Finally, I want to talk about it's actually a chapter in one of Anzaldúa's books called How to Tame a Wild Tongue, and say that Anzaldúa is calling for Chicano speakers to be creative with their communication. And let me just go to a portion of this text to help us elucidate this idea. So this is just a portion of her text, Borderlands, and it's from the chapter How to Tame a Wild Tongue. For a people who are neither Spanish nor live in a country which Spanish is the first language, for a people who live in a country in which English is the reigning tongue, but who are not Anglo, for a people who cannot entirely identify with either standard formal Castilian Spanish nor standard English, what recourse is left to them but to create their own language? Skipping down. Chicano Spanish sprang out of the Chicanos' need to identify ourselves as a distinct people. We needed a language with which we could communicate with ourselves, a secret language. So here we see in the call for creative communication an idea of, communication being a way of forming group identity in a creative manner. So this is a reminder to us once again that language is dynamic and we can be the creators of that dynamism. As I did indicate before, a bit of linguistic terrorism baked into this class for all of you Chicano or Chicano Spanish or formerly Spanish speakers, which is that I only speak a very limited amount of Spanish, and I'm going to be asking you to speak English in this course. So maybe for you is how do you preserve some of your uniqueness, your identity, the creativity of your language, while still meeting the demands of speaking English in a public speaking course. You're going to need to be a creative and ingenious rhetorician to do so. And so I hope that this might inspire you to think about that. Okay, finally, we're going to turn our attention to Western rhetorical tradition. This is probably the mainstream tradition in the United States that most typical public speaking classes will be grounded in and almost talk about exclusively. You might not see your public speaking teachers even mentioning other traditions. But let's quickly go through this, and you might see some of these ideas echoed throughout our textbook. The Western rhetorical tradition, I'm going to be using Aristotle's ideas and focus on him, and I just want to go through it really quickly. The word rhetoric comes to us from the Greeks, and it essentially means persuasion. I've been using it this whole time, but essentially when we're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about the act of persuasion. In the Western tradition, there's a tendency to view the act of communication itself as an act of trying to change other people, to persuade other people. The Greeks at the time referred to this, Aristotle, referred to this as a kind of movement of the soul. That rhetoric is the art of using language to move the soul, okay? In more contemporary language, we might say change the mind. You have to remember that at the time of ancient Greece, they didn't know what the brain was. I think Aristotle actually thought it was a cooling mechanism for the blood, and so they associated the mind and the soul as the kind of same thing. So the goal in Western rhetoric is typically to evoke some sort of change in your audience. It's a disruptive force if we want to compare it to the Asia-centric rhetoric we were talking about before. So it takes as its model a kind of activism, if you will. Okay, so Aristotle defines rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given situation all available means of persuasion. And this is really the definition that launches the study of public speaking and communication in the Western tradition. It gives the proper field of study. So what should we be studying when we're studying public speaking? According to Aristotle, he says you should be considering what the situation is that you're in, right? So that's the any given situation part. You find yourself in a certain situation. You need to be able to observe from within that situation what are the means or the ways or the methods by which I can be persuasive, right? So to him, rhetoric is observing what's possible to say in order to be persuasive and then evaluating what you should actually go about saying in order to achieve your persuasive goals. Okay, so that's the study of public speaking to rhetoric. So you may be asking, well, what are these means of persuasion then, Aristotle? And Aristotle gives us a pretty neat answer. He's going to give us the three main means of persuasion, or ways of being persuasive. And these might be familiar to you. They are ethos, pathos, and logos. Really quickly, ethos is the speaker's credibility, their character. Are they a good person? Do they do good deeds? Do they speak honestly? If you encounter a person who you know to have good ethos, to be an honest, trustworthy, good charactered person, we're going to more likely trust them and their message. And in fact, if we don't have enough time, if we're not that knowledgeable, that ethos might be so persuasive that we're convinced without even hearing their reasons, right? 9 out of 10 dentists say I should do something. Well, I'm not going to go to dentistry school and verify this. I'm just going to take their word for it. My dentist is a pretty nice woman. So, okay. Pathos refers to appeals to emotions, right? Trying to arouse our emotions in order to persuade us. We are feeling things, and Aristotle tells us that one way that we can persuade people is to get them angry, or to make them happy, or to make them jealous. Honestly, though, Aristotle mostly warns us against pathos, and sees pathos as kind of as something that can lead us astray, or lead us to make bad choices, or to believe wrong things. We've later on come to appreciate more the importance of pathos and how it can be used well and ethically. But Aristotle originally is pretty suspicious of pathos, and on the other hand, he favors what he calls logos, the third appeal, and the one that he's going to write most about, the third way of being persuasive, and the one he's going to spend most of his career developing, which is logic. Logic is kind of like conceptual math. If A is true and B is true, then C must also be true. This is a logical syllogism. We take two known facts, we add them together to deduce a third fact. We logically reason our way to the conclusion. Okay, so it's rationality and reason, and that's really kind of the most favored approach in the Western rhetorical tradition. We'll talk more about these three, you'll read more about these three later. We'll talk about them in other lectures throughout the semester. But those three are a pretty good backbone of understanding the three main ways of being persuasive, at least in the Western tradition. And finally, I want to talk about a little bit more of a more contemporary idea and updating of Aristotle by a guy named Bitzer and his idea of the rhetorical situation. In the Western tradition, we tend to view an act of communication as occurring within a certain rhetorical situation. And the rhetorical situation is really made up of three elements. There's got to be some problem, some social problem that is calling for action. It's calling for somebody to say something about it, to do something about it, to propose a plan, right? So there's a problem at the heart of any rhetorical situation. If there wasn't a problem, there'd be no need to communicate from the Western rhetorical tradition. Okay. In addition to the situation being defined by the problem, the situation is also defined by the audience. Who do we need to persuade? Who do we need to move to solve this problem? Who are we talking to? Who are we sending our message to? So the situation is made by the problem and the audience, and finally by the constraints. What's possible given the material reality and the situation that we deal with, right? What can we do given the amount of resources we have, given this audience's set of beliefs, What's possible for me to persuade? And so from the Western rhetorical tradition, we would say the rhetorician has to work from within this situation creatively to try to craft or discover the available means of persuading that audience to solve that problem given these constraints. So you'll see here that in the Western rhetorical tradition, rhetoric, public speaking, is very much closely linked to the operation of society, government, democracy. It's about civic engagement and trying to guide the collective actions of society through speech. Okay, so those are the four traditions that I wanted to spend some time talking about today. We started the lecture by discussing Cesar Chavez's work and how public speaking is inherently an act of advocacy and civic engagement. And we also talked about the ways in which public speaking belongs to different cultural traditions. We talked about Afrocentrism and the centering of African American experiences in our learning of public speaking. How can we draw from that tradition as we move forward as public speakers? The Asiacentrism point of view can also inform and inspire us, in particular, to think more about how we can use communication to bring harmony into our environments. The Chicano movement and the Chicano tradition has informed a creative approach to communication and showed us a bit about rhetoric in the borderlands. And finally, the Western approach, the Aristotelian approach, you'll be hearing about more throughout the semester, will give us a kind of rational approach to making arguments throughout the semester. All of these have similar values. They're not opposites. They're not completely distinct from one another. They all align with each other, I think, in great ways. And they're all our heritage. No matter your particular genes or your particular nationality of your parents or ethnicity of your parents, if you're living here in the United States, these are all of our cultural traditions to draw from. They're all valuable, and I hope that you take some inspiration from each.